Welcome back, everybody. How was that for you? What were you learning from your friends that were in your group with you? Megan, did I hear you say you had some damage to the building?
Yes. So I'm at Vision Core, which is downtown Lancaster. We share Market Alley with the police station, and during the protesting this weekend, we had graffiti damage to our building. But I told the group that fortunately, part of our industry where we make and distribute products for the government, one of the products we make is graffiti remover. So we were able to fix that without a lot of, there was no, thankfully, physical damage. And we were able to fix the cosmetic damage pretty quickly.
Wow. What are the chances of an organization getting graffiti that just happens to have the solution right at the fingertips?
Right there. Yeah, we lucked out. And our boss kind of said, hey, get on the phone with the county and tell them that we have this here.
Yeah.
You know, for anyone else that's experiencing it, because it works really well. So
that's amazing. Yeah. What about the rest of you? How are you guys doing? Were any of you, the other organizations, impacted in any way by the protests? No. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about our topic today, but first I'd love to see a show of hands. How many of your organizations are doing pretty well right now, either because you got PPP loans, you had some donors come through, you've done some other things to be fairly stable in the midst of all this? I mean, I know no one's like rocking it at the moment, but if you had to grade from like, I'm really afraid we're going to shut our doors, you know, within the next couple months, to we can ride this out for the next 5 years, where would you sort of see yourselves? Pretty okay overall? Anyone that's really struggling with the thumbs down sign? No? Okay. I'm curious because I've been working with a lot of organizations throughout this, and I feel like there's a sense of like, well, it's weird right now. It's hard right now. We got over the hump of figuring out how to do things from home, and we've started to shift our services. But overall, in terms of finances, we're relatively okay. And I was talking to one of my clients who said that, you know, they can see their way through this year without any problem, and they think they'll be okay next year. But it's year 3 where they're really anticipating the hurt coming in. And so how many of you, and again, you can use your little show of hands button, are thinking in terms of like 2 to 3 years out? 1 of you, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, it's a little weird right now, right? To think that we're okay right now, but we can't predict what's gonna come next. So I thought we would revisit, and I'm gonna share my screen again, some of the, a slide that I used in one of my earlier presentations to guide our conversation. So those of you that have participated in previous webinars, I had one called Anticipating the Slump, and I shared this diagram. And this comes from Jeff Brooks' Fundraising. So just to recap briefly, because I know it's kind of small on the screen, usually in times of crisis, the fundraising trend can be captured in sort of 3 phases. And the first phase is, you know, the bump, where we see a surge in generosity and lots of money coming in, big donations coming in, sort of a rally. And then after that initial rally, we go into what's called the slump. And that's when the initial donors either feel like they did what was needed and things are fine now, or attention gets diverted and people get distracted. But you go into this place where fundraising feels like it's drying up. For us right now, we all usually experience a certain level of slumping in the summertime because that's not the busiest time of year in terms of fundraising. So if this slump were to happen, it would feel like that, but exponentially so. And that phase 2 usually lasts from 4 to 6 months. And then phase 3 is the surge. And so that's the recovery of giving. And the good news is there is always a recovery of giving. And that can be about 4 months. And then beyond that, it sort of stabilizes. And that surge of giving is usually led by major donors. So it's a way of sort of turning some people's attention back around to, hey, we still need your support. So for those of you in York, I think Give Local was perfectly timed in many ways because you were right in the middle of that initial bump. And you saw the results. You had an overwhelming amount of donations that came in that day. You beat your goal from last year. Um, and then for those of you that are in Lancaster, I think Extra Give is going to fall during that period of phase 3 a little bit. So that idea of the return to a higher level of giving and being led by major donors. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about your Extra Give strategies. But what we might be going into right now is the slump. And I can't actually tell because I'm not an economist, and I also am not a psychic, although I sort of wish I were. But when I look at how my clients are responding right now and what I'm feeling in my own life is I feel like there was this initial surge of like, okay, all hands on deck, we're going to fix this, we're going to rally together, a lot of generosity coming in. And now as organizations are preparing to go back into their offices and to resume more routine, I'm not going to say normal, more routine program offerings, your attention is going away from that immediate crisis and into the long-term planning. And the same is true for what's going on in the lives of your donors, right? So they're returning to their jobs probably, or they're sending their kids to summer. Well, they can't even send their kids to summer camp. So the people with children are going to be stuck at home for a really long time. Super sorry about that for you all. But there are other things that are coming back online that they have to pay attention to. So we might be hitting a slump soon. We might not, because this is not a natural disaster. This is a pandemic, which is not exactly the same as a hurricane or the fires in Australia, for example. But if it's going to look like anything, it's going to look like a previous time of crisis in our country. And since they're saying that there's going to be a recession and it could be a long recession, we're looking at an impact of COVID for many, many months, maybe even years, which is not good news, but it can be helpful to think about it because then we can start planning long term. And I always like to have a plan. So for those of you that are doing okay right now, and okay, varying degrees of okay, but you can use this time to start making models and start making plans on what you can do in year 2 and year 3 to continue to weather this storm. So evaluating your business model for mission, impact, and profitability, and many of those of you that are joining me today from York are part of the workshop series that I'm offering there to do that. For those of you that are in Lancaster, I do have an open series available. It'll kick off June 10th if you want to participate, so you would get the same information, just not in York, in Lancaster, and you can find that more information about that on my website. If we're going into a recession, if we're going into a sort of a long-term slump, the ways to mitigate against that are to continue to keep your foot on the gas in terms of communicating with your audience. And that communication should be nimble, it should be immediate, it should be personable, and it should be segmented. So what I mean by nimble is you should be able to adjust your communication tactics based on the kind of information that you want to share or the kind of services you want to offer. And so not getting stuck in, well, we always send newsletters out the first of the month. You might need to start sending your communication materials out on a different schedule or in different formats. So give yourself permission to experiment and be nimble in how you're communicating with your audiences. If you were part of my previous webinars, you've heard me say this, but I'm going to say it again. Newsletters aren't enough right now. You need to find additional methods for talking to your audiences. And that's where the personable and segmented elements of your communication come in. So determining which groups of your audience need what kinds of conversation, whether it's a phone call, a handwritten note, forwarding the newsletter with an email, a personal email attached, just to make sure that it intervenes in their life and they get to see it. If you want to call together groups of donors and do a fireside chat or a State of the Union update, all of those techniques might be appropriate for different levels of your donors. And I would think that the higher the donor is, the more money they're giving to you, the more personable and segmented and face-to-face that communication should be. We're still in the period where we don't get to do a lot of like actual physical contact with one another. We're all still hungry for that kind of contact. So as much as possible, you want to approximate that with some of the other techniques. So moving forward, even if we are able to gather in small groups 6 feet apart, I still think relying on things like Zoom or Microsoft Teams will be really important. It's going to help you reach audiences. There are going to be people who are still afraid to get together in groups for a period of time. So even if we might legally be allowed to do that, there's going to be a segment of your donor base that is going to be afraid to do that. So you want to continue to offer options in Zoom, in a FaceTime, not FaceTime, Facebook Live, all of those other things that they can still see and get information. And then immediate. So things change rapidly. You can have a plan, and that plan is going to look different from one week to the next. But it's really important that you communicate every step of the way what's going on in your organization. So if you haven't already, start to talk to your donors about what it means for your organization to be moving into the yellow, and what your timeline is for being back in your offices, and what you're thinking about in terms of when you can open up different services again. Those things might change, and that's okay, but the more you can push that information out, the more you'll keep your donors close to you, even as they start to get pulled in other directions in their own life. I would also say that you should, if you're not already, advocate on behalf of yourself and your sector with government officials and funders. So I've been working with a group of organizations out in the Olympic Peninsula, and I've been working in particular with one of the funders out there, and they're trying to be as responsive as they can to the needs of the different nonprofits, and they're shifting how they've allocated resources, how they're determining what grants get sent. They came up with a totally different funding stream for this year, and it's because of the information that they were getting from the local nonprofits about what those nonprofits needed. So I know the Lancaster County Community Foundation and the York County Community Foundations are trying to be very responsive right now. So the more you can talk to them about what your true needs are, and then along with them, your government officials, the more you can ensure that there will be a variety of supports to you as this plays out. The other thing I would say is that you really do need to practice radical self-care right now. And I'm curious to hear from the group, what are some of the things that you all do in terms of self-care?
I'll go. I've returned to taking a morning walk, and before this all hit, I had just started getting back into the gym. Well, I should say going to the gym, not back into. And it was a new routine for me. It was something I could do at the end of the day to kind of just like work it out, and it was good. And then when I couldn't do that anymore, I found myself really slumping. I didn't want to go out for a walk, even though I have a beautiful park across the street, and I wasn't motivated to do it. And just within the past few weeks, I've been back at that, and I've been making time to do it in the morning so that I can really give myself a good start to the day. And it's doing my mind some good too.
I was gonna say, how's it feel?
It's good. It's really nice.
Are there other things that you guys are doing to take care of yourselves during this time?
Hi all, this is Amanda Hickel.
Hey, Amanda Hickle.
Hey, Danny Beam. I'll just say quickly that I've been really kind of reticent to take days off. Like I feel like I've had to be on all the time and present and available and to staff and to, donors. And so lately I've been really trying to be a little bit more kind of attentive to, okay, I need to take like a Friday off and not be connected and be not available. And it's okay because everything will be fine. So that's been my challenge with self-care.
That's a good one. How many of you also feel like you need to be on and available all the time? Yeah, you don't. I mean, so I kind of do too, in a certain respect, but the reality of it is that like we can only do so much, and if we're not taking care of ourselves, we have nothing left to give to other people. And I came up with this idea that I'm going to share with you, and I don't know if it would work in your organization, but I hope it does, which is for you all to start thinking about how you could shuffle so that every staff person, if they wanted to, could be working the equivalent of a 4-day work week. So that might look like taking 2 afternoons off or a morning and after, but how could you cover the services that are needed to be covered during this time, but giving you all the permission to take some extra time for yourselves, because I feel like there's just an impossible load that you're being asked to carry right now. And the choices that you are having to make require so much brain power that it's just not possible to keep doing everything that you've been doing without some sort of break or intervention or a way of getting into a different headspace. And it's doubly hard, right? Because for me, my different headspace, if I were working during the day, then it would be to come home. And so that was sort of restorative for me. But since I'm in my house all the time, there isn't that sort of concrete shift that helps me get into a different headspace. So please give yourself permission to take time, and it is okay. Everyone is feeling the same thing right now in terms of that. So if you're out of the office says, I'm taking an afternoon for self-care, as long as your supervisor allows you to do that, I would strongly encourage you to say that. And it's going to model good behavior for other people too. So it'll give permission. So yeah, Amanda, take the time that you need, because it's not going to help anyone if you're totally fried.
Thanks, Danny.
Yeah, Ruby said she pets her puppy, she walks every day, she's cooking and eating only freshly prepared meals, breathing, painting, gardening. That sounds pretty dreamy. Any other things that you guys are doing to take care of yourselves?
This might sound a little kind of opposite here, but I think for me, one of the most important things has been, when you're an achiever, which I imagine a lot of the people in this call would relate to, achieving, performing, sometimes the most important thing is to give yourself mental permission not to, and to rest. And not just that, not as far as just the doing, but the grace that comes along with all the things related to accommodating, changing, adjusting. So some of that, just being very aware of what's happening inside, mentally, emotionally, and then working hard to make space for it. I mean, maybe some of you have better luck with that being more natural. That wasn't wired up in me growing up. So it's taken a lot of effort. The other thing, just practically speaking, has been, I do a FaceTime with coffee in the morning with one of my best friends, as not every day, but a matter of routine. And then again, just being real focused on what that ritual and routine looks like. So that's one of them. And then being able to shift and change, because like somebody had just mentioned about working out and going to the gym, that was very much part of my routine earlier. And what does that look like now that kids are home and you're homeschooling and all the things that you just mentioned as well. So I think a combination of those things is what's been beneficial for me.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Mary Kay said yoga. That's another good one. Any other tips or tricks?
Yeah, I think the thing I would say is to take the time to check in with yourself and to turn off your phone or email or computer. My anxiety level was through the roof like a week and a half ago. And I couldn't figure out why, because like I, do my run in the morning and do a walk at night and try to build in the time to be out of my office by 6 o'clock. But what I found is because I'm a achiever model, and right now my achievements don't look the way that I'm used to them looking. I started working really hard during the day, and then as soon as the day would end, I would start home projects. So like having to install a new patio in 2 days and just these crazy things to make myself feel accomplished. And it really took until last week where I was like, oh, I'm being a total nutball. Like I'm not giving myself time to relax. And those outside projects are making me feel really good about what I didn't feel like I was getting at work. But they were exhausting. So yeah, I think to Mandy's point, just really taking the time to check in with yourself and make sure you're really practicing self-care.
Yeah, that's a good one. I also think, Heather, I appreciate your story about the nutball projects, like the certain level of humor around all of this. Like we're all a little bit nutty right now. For example, I thought it was a good idea to try to train my cat to go on a harness to go outside with me. And that did not end well because the Instagram photos of cats walking on harnesses, they lie. That's not a real thing. So she figured out how to get out of it in about 0.2 seconds while she was outside. And so fortunately, she was scared enough that she scurried inside, but it backfired on me because she now has a taste of what it means to be outside. So every time I open the door, she's trying to sneak out, but she won't get back in the harness. So yeah, we're all a little nutty right now, and we come up with some ideas that aren't great. And so I think having a sense of humor around the fact that maybe we're not the best version of ourselves, and maybe our, Snow is loving her freedom, Amanda, that is for sure. And just to go with what Mandy said about grace, like just a little bit of grace. And then the last thing I would offer is just acknowledging how resilient we all actually are. Look at all of the stuff that we've just adapted to in only a few months' time, and look at all of the ways that we have decided to practice self-care and to cope. So sometimes when we look back and see how far we've come, that can also help us keep moving forward. And I think that's important. And the reason why I put radical self-care on this PowerPoint is because if this thing is going to go years, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so we need to be able to find the things that we can create as sort of foundational activities or elements in our life so that we can continue to do the work that we need to do for the next couple years to move our organizations forward, to serve the people that we need to serve, but also, not wreck our health or our mental or spiritual well-being in the process. So I'm glad that you guys have found the things that are helping you, and I would just encourage you all to continue them. I would also just make a mental note that you should not try to put a cat on a harness, because that's not one of the things that will help you long term. And then finally, keep asking, so typos. Keep asking for support, donations, and expertise from your constituents. That's part of your mission. It's part of your function as an organization. And if we do go into a recession, there can sometimes be this feeling of, oh, we shouldn't be asking right now because people's lives are hard. But it is your job to ask. And it's also important to remember that donors have a need, like a fundamental human need to give and to respond to the broken places in our world. And so by you creating vehicles for them to contribute, you're actually helping them fulfill that need that they have. So it's okay to ask. In particular, I would do a combination of asking for donations and expertise. We've gotten really creative in the past couple months, and there's a lot of talent in your donor base that isn't just money. So tapping into what those talents are is going to help you build community. It's going to keep your donors close to you, and it's going to keep them supporting you even if we do go into a long-term recession. Here are a couple things not to do. Don't cut your sales team in a down economy. So I worked for a couple years for a national consulting firm that did fundraising and capital campaign consulting, and I was working with them during the last Great Recession, so right in the middle of a lot of the economy bottoming out. And they made a strategic decision to add to their sales team. And so in this case, it would be add to the people that are helping you fundraise in your organization and communicate with your audiences, because they knew that it was going to be harder to do. And so you needed more resources to lean into that area in the hopes that you would be able to maintain what you were raising before or continue to grow your organization. If you try to scale back what you're doing in fundraising to save expenses or to make more room in the budget for program people, and I'm not saying program people aren't important, they absolutely are. The impact of that, however, will be that you're not going to have the bandwidth that you need to work your audience in a way that during this time will generate the results that you need. So don't cut your sales team in a down economy. If you can invest money in audience engagement. So your communications, your marketing, your social media, because again, we're seeing that more smaller level donations are coming in from a broader variety of people. So you need the resources to have a really good marketing strategy to cast that wide net. And then also invest your resources in stewardship and cultivation activities for your current donors and for your prospective donors. Asking is important, but holding on to the donors that you have now is more important than finding new donors. So the more you can work with your existing donor base and put the resources in that, the better you'll be able to weather this. And that goes back to the chart where we see that the surge happens because of the work that happens with major donors. So if you have the resources to invest in cultivating and stewarding your major donors, you're going to come out of this slump more quickly than you would if you didn't do that. Don't send out an emergency appeal unless you absolutely have to and you have no other options. I don't know how many of you saw the YM Lancaster's emergency appeal. And my heart breaks for that organization, and they are not my client, because if they were, I would have told them to do it differently. So what can happen if you send out an emergency appeal? My first question anyway was, how did you get to this point in the first place? Like, why? What wasn't working? What weren't you doing so that you have to get to the point where you're sending a mass email out to the entire community of, if you don't give us money, we have to shut our doors? And then, while that might be true, and sometimes there are circumstances that are plumb outside of your control, like a pandemic, there was no information about what the plan was on how the money was going to be used, how the organization would stabilize, and how they were going to make sure that they weren't in that position in the future. So there's a lot of information that you need to address if you're going to send out an emergency appeal that usually, if you're at that point in a crisis, you can't. So I would encourage you to, way before you get to that point, come up with some plans, do your fundraising so that you don't have to send out an emergency appeal. If you absolutely have to send something like that out, know that you need to address how you got there in the first place. You need to have a plan in place for how you're not going to get in that place again in the future. And you should probably also inform your audience on the amount of money that you need in order to stabilize the organization. And hopefully you are sending out that appeal, but you're also segmenting your base and working with your donors differently than just sending out an appeal and hoping for the best. So don't send it out unless you absolutely have to. If you do, follow those other steps. And the last thing not to do is don't try to fundraise on your own. So for those of you that are the primary fundraiser for your organization, this is the time, more than usual, for fundraising to be a team effort throughout the whole organization. Because we're going into a time where you're going to have to work harder to keep the revenue that you have, let alone grow your organization, you need more hands on deck. You can't do it all. You'll burn out. You'll make yourself sick and miserable. And there's a high degree of burnout in fundraising positions to begin with. So this is the time for you to identify the ways that your program staff can help support fundraising, how your board members can help support fundraising, and play the quarterback role where you're calling the shots and having everyone else execute their aspects of the play. That's the extent of what I know about football. I probably got it wrong, but hopefully you know what I mean. So involve as many people as possible, and if they balk at that because they think it's not their job, send them to me and I will talk to them about it, because this is not normal. So what is normally their job would be lovely in a normal environment, but this is an unusual environment, so it's going to call for unusual measures. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So last thing I would just say, or not say, but ask is, what have you done during the past couple months where we've been at home in terms of audience engagement that you would like to keep moving forward? Like keep doing in terms of either how you've talked to them, what offerings you've given, what are some of the things that have been working well for you that you want to hold on to?
I'll jump in here because I've been really proud of the History Center and how our staff's handled this. We've been really nimble to do virtual programming, which is never our forte in the past. The majority of our demographic, when we have reached out to them, they have not been very interested in virtual programming. They preferred in person. And now they've become very interested in virtual programming quite quickly. So we did an entire virtual program day for Give Local York, and we're continuing to do that. So I hope that our virtual engagement continues. We did tap into that from a development standpoint. I think it was after, Danny, one of your sessions, it was to talk about considering fireside chats. And so I talked to Joan, our CEO and president, and then our board chair and vice chair. And we did a real quick turnaround on a fireside chat with our donors to talk to them about how we've been engaging the community. It was pretty effortless. It took about an hour to do a PowerPoint, 5 minutes to set up a webinar and put them on there. But I was able to email 400 donors, and a lot of our major donors attended, or they responded to me to communicate through email. So it ended up being pretty high ROI on our part in terms of engagement. And so we already have a session planned in July to talk specifically about the Steam Plant project, our capital campaign to build a new museum, and where we're at. So I'm hoping that that continues, because we do need to build in more stewardship activities. But of course, with COVID, we don't see a larger stewardship budget in year 2 and year 3. So I think that if we could do 1 or 2 state of the organization updates virtually in addition to our annual meeting, that's going to help us quite a bit. So those are my additions.
Those are great. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing. Like, once you buy the Zoom account, it's free, right? They're not super expensive to do. Other ideas of things that you want to hold on to? Did any of you have any luck getting your board members to help you during these few months? Heather did. Anyone else? Megan?
Yeah. Excuse me. We've always been big on sending like handwritten thank you notes. I mean, we send a formal acknowledgement, and then a few weeks later we'd send handwritten notes, but we really ramped it up during the pandemic because we had rehab services team that needed some stuff to do. So we were like, okay, we'll have them write these. And we also included the board in that. And we've sent out over 800 handwritten thank you notes to donors. And they've sent money back. They've sent thank you notes for the thank you notes. But the board themselves, they sent out over 200 in the last month or so. And, you know, I think it was one of your webinars, I can't remember, but one of them, that how important it is for people to hear from the board right now. And so we really pushed that and got a good response. And they continue to say, oh, send me 20 more cards and 20 more names. And I just do click and ship through the computer and send them on their way, and they send them out for us. So it's been great.
That's awesome. Heather, you were nodding. Did you have a similar experience?
Our board has been fantastic about being involved. So for Give Local York, they did thank you calls to everyone. And that's just one example. You know, obviously Patty and Rich jumping on to do a presentation on the state of the organization, and they did follow-up thank you emails to everyone that attended. So in terms of our board, when they were aware of what gaps we were going to have in fundraising because of events being canceled and some of our operations slowing down, they stepped up to the plate there. And then anytime I've reached out to anybody to help make a connection or to help follow up with stewardship, I have had no issue. They've just been so willing to support me in any way. I have just learned with the board that they're there to support, but they don't know how to. So all you have to do is ask. And for our board, everything I've asked, they've offered to do.
That's awesome. Has anyone had a different experience? No. Okay, so one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about this planning 2-3 years out, let me just drill down in that one a little bit, and then I'll send you on your way. So what I would recommend is that you come up with metrics, programmatic metrics and financial metrics, and that you should hit quarterly. And if you don't hit them, then you need to have plans for how you're going to stabilize your budget. So I would do that quarterly over at least 1.5 years, 2 years. And you're going to have to check in with those and adjust them, of course, quarterly. So your metric for 2 years out is probably going to look a lot different by the time you get there than what you're projecting right now. But it's better to sort of map them because then you can say, okay, if we don't raise this much money by the third quarter, then we need to do X, Y, and Z things differently to balance the budget. So looking at that on a regular basis. Remember that hope is not a strategy. So you want to have a good plan in place. And when you're evaluating things, it's not just what can you trim or who can you lay off, but it's other expenses that you might be able to renegotiate contracts. You might decide to increase your ticket prices if there's something that you do that's ticket based. So there are a lot of different strategies before you have to lay people off. But I would have all of that list of what all of those strategies could be. So as you hit your metrics or don't hit them, you can say, okay, so based on where we are, these are the strategies we want or the tactics that we want to implement, you know, between now and the next 6 months to make sure that we stay on track. So combining those pieces and checking in with them regularly is, one, going to help you feel like you're in so much more control of this whole process. And two, it's going to give you a clear path so that you're not going to get to the point where you're having to send out an emergency, please keep our lights open solicitation, because you'll have a plan that will prevent you from getting to that point. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. Any last questions, comments before I send you on your way? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. It was great to see your faces, and I hope to see you the next one of these. There will be 2 more. There's going to be one on July 1st, and then there's the last one will be August 3rd. I said August 1st in my original email, but that's a Saturday, and I'm not working on a Saturday, and neither are you. So July 1 and then August 3rd, okay?
Thanks, Dan.
Yep. Bye, guys.
Bye.